Les damos las bienvenidas a todos y a todas a esta segunda conferencia del ciclo Sentir y emocionarse, dimensiones de la afectividad en el mundo griego antiguo. Agradecemos a todos su participación, especialmente al profesor Douglas Cairns, que gentilmente aceptó la invitación para compartir con todos nosotros este encuentro. Le dejo la palabra a mi colega Emiliano Huiz para la presentación del profesor invitado. Muchas gracias.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Claudia. Ahí todavía hay gente que se está terminando de conectar. Bueno, un gran gusto y un placer verlos y verlas por segunda vez un sábado a la mañana. En este caso ya, por lo menos para la Argentina, entrando en las vacaciones de invierno, así que es un doble mérito que ustedes estén acompañándonos esta mañana. Algunas cuestiones administrativas y logísticas para que, dado que somos muchos, el desarrollo de la conferencia sea lo menos complicado posible. Les pedimos en todo momento que por favor mantengan los micrófonos silenciados. Apenas ingresan, ustedes ya tienen el micrófono en silencio, con lo cual esto no debería ser problemático. Si en algún momento ven que la conexión está muy lenta, les vamos a pedir que apaguen por favor la cámara, porque esto muchas veces facilita también la conectividad. El profesor Cairns va a hablar compartiendo una pantalla para poder seguir mejor su texto, pero de todas maneras hay un handout que el profesor Cairns nos hizo llegar, que voy a compartir en este momento, si puedo. A ver. Porque está bueno que lo tengan a mano. Bueno, no estoy pudiendo.
La idea es cargarlo en el chat, ¿verdad? ¿Para qué?
Ahí está. Esperen que ahí viene. Ustedes, lo que les vamos a pedir es que por favor traten de tener ese texto a mano. Ahí está. Si ustedes abren el chat, el archivo se acaba de enviar, así que lo pueden directamente descargar para poder tenerlo durante la exposición. Respecto a las preguntas, el profesor Cairns va a hablar más o menos durante 40 minutos. Vamos a habilitar luego las preguntas a través del chat. Así que les pedimos, por favor, que escriban las preguntas en el chat. Lo pueden hacer de dos maneras. Lo pueden hacer en inglés directamente y entonces Claudia va a procesar las preguntas, o en castellano, y en todo caso la traduciremos para el profesor Cairns. Debido a que la experiencia nos dice que las preguntas van a ser muchas, por suerte, Claudia va a intentar organizarlas y encontrar los puntos en común entre las preguntas para tratar de canalizar la mayor parte de interrogantes de manera simultánea. Por lo tanto, les vamos a pedir encarecidamente que traten de limitar las preguntas en su extensión para que sean lo más concretas posibles y reducir al máximo los comentarios, de modo que podamos tener más posibilidades de preguntar en mayor medida al profesor Cairns. Estimamos, y esto fue lo que habíamos acordado, más o menos contar con 1 hora y media de tiempo, así que estaríamos terminando hacia las 13 horas horario de Argentina. Digo, para que a priori ya comprendan nuestras disculpas si no podemos canalizar todas las preguntas de todos y todas quienes están presentes. Dicho esto, Claudia, no sé si me estoy olvidando de alguna cuestión logística.
No, creo que no.
Bueno, entonces vamos a pasar a presentar. Now, Douglas, we're going to introduce you. Vamos a presentarlo a Douglas. Douglas Cairns, además de ser un amigo tanto de la Universidad de La Plata como de la Universidad de Buenos Aires, es uno de los grandes especialistas en el estudio de las emociones en el mundo antiguo. Douglas Cairns trabaja sobre la sociedad griega, sobre aspectos de la ética, sobre aspectos de la literatura griega, especialmente a través del foco de las emociones. En términos académicos, Douglas Cairns es catedrático de estudios clásicos, de Classics, en la Universidad de Edimburgo desde el año 2004 y anteriormente tuvo cargos docentes en las universidades de St. Andrews, Otago, Leeds y Glasgow. Ha tenido también intervención como profesor visitante en Italia, en Pisa, en Japón, en Kioto y en Tokio, en Taiwán, Fujian y en los Estados Unidos como George Langford Family Eminent Scholar Chair en la Florida State University. Fue elegido como miembro de la Academia Europea en el año 2013. Tiene una membresía, una fellowship de la Royal Society of Edinburgh en el 2018 y además una fellowship en la British Academy el mismo año. Fue editor del célebre Journal of Hellenic Studies, que seguramente todos ustedes conocen, entre el 2016 y el 2020, y actualmente es director de la Asociación de Estudios Clásicos del Reino Unido entre el 2020 y el 2025. Ha tenido muchísimos proyectos de colaboración, voy a mencionar solo algunos. Un proyecto titulado A History of Distributed Cognition entre el 2014 y el 2017 en el Research Council para Artes y Humanidades del Reino Unido. El proyecto Emotions Through Time, From Antiquity to Byzantium, del 2016 al 2018. Un proyecto sobre el honor en Grecia clásica entre el 2018 y el 2022 del European Research Council. Y fue Fellow Mercator de la Johannes Gutenberg Universität de Mainz entre el 2018 y 2019. Y actualmente tiene, además, es titular de una Anneliese Meyer Forschungspreis que fue dada por la Fundación Alexander von Humboldt en la Technische Universität de Dresden. Así que, como verán, sus proyectos de investigación particularmente se focalizan en las emociones. Su bibliografía es inmensa, todos seguramente conocen y han trabajado con su texto I2, The Psychology and Ethics of Honor and Shame in Ancient Greek Literature, que ha marcado claramente un punto de inflexión en los estudios, no solo sobre la épica, sino también sobre los valores y las emociones. Ha trabajado muchísimo y tiene textos sobre la Ilíada de Homero, sobre la influencia del pensamiento arcaico en la tragedia, y con relación a las emociones en particular, que es el tema que nos interesa, ha editado con Laurel Fulkerson el texto Emotions Between Greece and Rome en el 2015, con Damien Nellis Emotions in the Classical World, Methods, Approaches and Directions en Stuttgart en el 2017. Tiene un texto sobre la risa y las lágrimas griegas que editó con Margaret Alexiou en el 2017. Y en el 2019, más recientemente, publicó una edición en Londres de un volumen colectivo, A Cultural History of Emotions in Antiquity. Así que creo que pocas personas están quizás más autorizadas para hablarnos hoy de emociones que Douglas Cairns, que hoy nos visita. El texto que nos va a presentar entonces Douglas hoy tiene que ver con la naturaleza de la compasión, así que vamos a introducirnos un poquito en el concepto de Helios en las fuentes arcaicas y clásicas, así que le dejo la palabra y la pantalla a Douglas. Douglas, the floor and the screen is yours. Thank you once again very much for joining us in this series of video conferences. Thanks again.
Thank you very much indeed, Emiliano, for this very, very kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be talking to you today. It would be even better to be in Buenos Aires and to be able to meet you all in person and maybe to go and see some tango later on in the evening. I have the most amazing memories of going to see tango with Cecilia the last time I was in Buenos Aires, and it was just fabulous. So I hope you'll invite me back one day in person when all of this unpleasantness with this wretched pandemic is over. So a little bit about this paper before we started. I was invited to a conference to be the only representative of classics in the conference. in Germany in a castle in the middle of nowhere between Gießen and Marburg. And the conference was about Barmherzigkeit, which is a fairly peculiar German term. So something like gentle-heartedness or something like that. And they wanted someone to talk about classical stuff alongside people talking about various religions and the role of Barmherzigkeit in Christian theology in particular. So this is why it's about compassion. I decided that I would use the term compassion in English for what I want to talk about, but I would focus in Greek on the term eleos. So the German term that they were dealing with in this conference, Barmherzigkeit, is basically a German attempt to recreate the Latin term misericordia. And if you look at Latin texts that talk about misericordia, when they talk about Greek concepts in those same texts, they tend to translate misericordia with eleos. So eleos is kind of the nearest thing to Barmherzigkeit. That's why my paper is called Barmherzigkeit on the screen in front of you. One other reason, so now I'm starting the paper as you see, one other reason for choosing compassion is that it's a relatively uncontroversial term. If I talked about sympathy, people would then wonder how I defined my position on the matter of the distinction between sympathy and empathy. So these are big issues in contemporary philosophy and emotion research. And the paper does touch on those issues, especially the distinction between sympathy and empathy, but I decided not to go into that. So you'll be able to tell what I think, but I'm not going to tell you explicitly what I think. I'm not going to get engaged in controversy for its own sake. I don't want to give you a lot of labels and jargon. So this isn't about contemporary academic controversies. It's more general than that. So what I want to do mainly is to confront the representation of pity in the final book of the Iliad with the theorization of pity in Aristotle's rhetoric. And that's why on the handout, which you will definitely need, you'll see that the front page is all Iliad 24, and most of the second page is the chapter on pity in Aristotle's rhetoric, book 2. So for the first bit of the talk, I'll be moving back and forward between page 1 and page 2 in the handout. So it'll be very good if you can have the handout open in front of you, either on screen or on paper. So that will then take me to some thoughts on the nature of pity and compassion in Homer in general. So not in those particular passages, but more generally. And then we'll come back to the contrast between Homer and Aristotle. And in that context, we will also have a brief look at some differences between Aristotle and Plato on how they understand the emotional effects of epic and tragedy. So let's start with Iliad 24, which is number 1 on the handout. So in this scene, in what's presented as an act of huge bravery, Priam enters Achilles' quarters to beg for the return of Hector's body for burial. Priam takes hold of Achilles' knees in supplication. He kisses the hands that killed Hector, and he makes his appeal. Although he also asks Achilles to respect the gods, he says, "Ideo Theus" in line 503, the core of Priam's speech is the appeal to Eleos. In the same line, he says, "Auton te eleison," pity me, myself. This pity is solicited with reference to Priam's own suffering, but it's also refracted, mirrored, through a relation of both similarity and difference between Priam and Achilles' own father, Peleus. At the beginning and the end of his appeal, Priam says explicitly, "Remember your father," lines 486 and 504. And so he emphasizes the closeness in age between himself and Peleus, and he emphasizes the trials that old age brings in lines 487 to 489. But Priam says in line 504 that he is more to be pitied. He's more eleeinos. This is because Peleus, as Priam represents it, rejoices in the news that his only son is still alive, whereas Priam has lost many of his sons, including the son that he relied on most of all, the one that he now calls his only son, Hector, in lines 499 to 501. And now Priam says, I've lost my only son, and I've taken the hands that killed that son and put them to my own lips, in lines 505 to 6. So Priam wants to make Achilles see him as a father, like his own father. He wants to imply that what's happened to Priam might happen to Peleus. And so Priam is appealing to a point that Aristotle will later make a great deal of in the rhetoric, the point that pity requires that we ourselves, or someone we care for, should be vulnerable to misfortune. To pity others, you have to be vulnerable yourself, or you have to be closely related to someone that you regard as vulnerable. So we'll come back to that in Aristotle in number 2 in the handout. This appeal to Achilles' memory of his father hits home, and Achilles and Priam weep intensely in the original passage in number 1 on the handout, 507 to 512. So just in the second paragraph there on page 1. But Achilles doesn't accept that Priam is more pitiable than Peleus. Achilles knows that he's going to die at Troy. There are well-known passages in Book 9 and Book 18 that indicate that. And so Achilles knows that Peleus will very soon experience a kind of grief that's very similar to Priam's. So the point that Priam has appealed to has hit home. In Priam's appeal to the similarity between himself and Peleus, there was also an assumption of difference, as Priam represents it, since Peleus' only son lives on, Peleus has a kind of prosperity that Priam has now lost. And this is another of Aristotle's conditions for pity. The sense of our own vulnerability that's essential for pity relies not only on a perception of similarity, that's what happened to this person might happen to me or someone I care for, but it also relies on a discrepancy between the pitier and the pitied. So the similarity and difference, in the sense that the pitier is better off, at least for the moment. In the moment at which the appeal is made, the person who is asked to show pity is regarded as better off than the person for whom they show pity. The vulnerability criteria in the rhetoric at 1385b, 14 to 33, rest fundamentally on the idea of potential suffering at some stage in the future. So for Aristotle, to pity another person, you shouldn't be suffering right now, but you should regard yourself as able to suffer in the future. But Achilles, in fact, contradicts Priam on this point. So Priam makes an Aristotelian appeal. He presupposes that Peleus is not so badly off as he is, and therefore Achilles is not so badly off as he is. But Achilles gives a non-Aristotelian response. And we'll say more about that in a minute. Just before we get to that, to say a little bit more about this language of similarity. So to support his appeal, Priam uses the language of likeness. When he says, remember your father Achilles, who's similar in age to me, we can compare Aristotle's words when he observes that people pity those who are similar to them in age. But of course, Priam's appeal isn't Aristotle's. Peleus isn't the person that Priam is appealing to, and the person he is appealing to, Achilles, is much younger than Priam is. And yet there is a sense in which Priam and Aristotle are making the same case, because the point of Aristotle's observation is that similarity promotes the sense of vulnerability. It's easier to imagine something happening to us when it happens to someone like us. And Priam's appeal makes that point, but simply at one step removed. Achilles' sense of his own vulnerability is evoked by the similarity not between Achilles and Priam, but between Peleus and Priam. And as Aristotle further observes, those who have living parents or children or wives can feel pity because parents are part of us and susceptible to the ills that excite pity. That's 1385b 27 to 29. So the point is here that our parents' or our children's vulnerability is our vulnerability. And so the likeness between Priam and Peleus is a sign that Achilles is also as vulnerable to misfortune as Priam has proved to be. Peleus's vulnerability is Achilles' vulnerability. And it's evident that Achilles has taken this fundamental point as the lesson of Priam's predicament, because he presents it to Priam himself as consolation for his sufferings. After they've wept together, Achilles takes Priam by the hand and raises him to his feet, and then he delivers a speech that draws the moral from their shared lamentation. This is again back in number 1 on the handout. In this very, very famous speech, probably the most famous and most important speech in the whole of Greek literature, Achilles points out that no human life can be without pain. The best you can expect is an alternation of good and bad fortune. As examples, Achilles offers his own father, Peleus, in 534 to 542, and Priam himself in 543 to 548. So he's underlining the very similarity that was the basis of Priam's appeal. Both Priam and Peleus surpassed other men in prosperity, but divine favor deserted them in their later years. They didn't have continuing prosperity. There was an alternation of good and bad. Peleus, Priam, and Achilles himself are exemplary figures, but they're exemplary of conditions that apply to all of us, to all human beings. The vulnerability that's a fundamental condition for pity is inherent in the human condition, and in that passage in Iliad 24, the human condition is defined by contrast with the condition of the gods, the condition of the divine. In presenting the mutability of fortune as a shared human predicament, Achilles is in effect pointing out not only that all human suffering is potentially pitiable, you can pity anyone, but also that all human beings, as long as they can recognize that their lives too are subject to change, subject to vicissitude, are potentially susceptible to pity. So anyone can attract pity and anyone can feel pity. Achilles' speech begins as an explicit expression of the pity that's attributed to him by the narrator in lines 515 to 16. So if you look there at the handout, you see I've given you the Greek terms. Achilles helps Priam to his feet. He feels pity for his grey hair and beard, and he begins his speech, "Ah, poor man, truly you endured many evils in your heart," at line 518. So Achilles affirms that he's come to understand how Priam has suffered. But the understanding of how Priam has suffered is rooted in the fact that Achilles himself has also suffered, as we see from the way in which Priam's appeal moves both of them to tears. Priam weeps, remembering Hector, in lines 509 to 10, but Achilles weeps, remembering not just Peleus, his father, but also Patroclus, in 511 to 512. And this creates an apparent dissonance with several things that Aristotle says about pity in the rhetoric. So this is coming back to that point I made earlier about Priam making an Aristotelian appeal, but Achilles giving a non-Aristotelian answer. So it's important that Priam is in mourning, but so is Achilles. When Priam weeps, his tears are tears of grief. But when Achilles weeps, so are his tears are tears of grief too. Achilles' mourning for Patroclus has continued from Book 18 to the present episode. But his tears for Peleus, his father, also express a form of grief that takes Peleus' suffering in advance, proleptically, as if it were actual rather than potential. So he's weeping for Peleus as though Peleus were suffering right now. Priam's grief for Hector and Achilles' grief for Peleus and Patroclus illustrate Aristotle's point in number 2 in the handout, in Book 2 of the Rhetoric, that we regard the sufferings of people closest to us as our own sufferings. He says this at 1386a 19 to 20. And so we don't pity those people because they're not separate from ourselves, they're part of ourselves, he says at 1386a, 18 to 19. So Patroclus's fate and Peleus's fate are essentially Achilles' fate. And of course, Hector's fate is Priam's fate. So Priam isn't pitying Hector, and Achilles isn't pitying Patroclus or Peleus. But Aristotle also thinks, this is an important point, that if we focus on our own sufferings, including the sufferings of those dearest to us, then we can't pity other people either. This is why he says that those who are utterly ruined are incapable of pity at 1385b, 19 to 20. So people who are suffering themselves right now, who are utterly ruined by their own misfortunes, are focused not on their vulnerability in the future to potential suffering, but on the sufferings that they've actually incurred and that they are suffering right now. Similarly, people who are utterly terrified by the immediate prospect of suffering don't think of the vulnerability that links them to others, they just think of themselves. And people who think terrible events are just about to happen to them, or those who are closest to them, are said by Aristotle to be no longer capable of pity at 86a, 22 to 25. So in all these cases, Aristotle makes several times the same point, that the agent's own misfortune is present or imminent, it's just about to happen, and so that person can't feel pity. The basic discrepancy in these cases that Aristotelian pity demands between the suffering other and the only potentially suffering self is absent. If you're suffering yourself, Aristotle says, you shouldn't be able to suffer other people, to pity other people. But this discrepancy is also absent in the way that Achilles' pity coexists with intense grief at the loss of his closest friend, and with vivid imagination of the imminent suffering of his father. So Achilles is suffering. He's suffering the pains of Patroclus and he's suffering the pains of Peleus. He's suffering right now. He weeps for his own misfortunes, and yet he can still pity Priam. So that's something that Aristotle says shouldn't happen. Now, probably we can think of ways of saving Aristotle's generalizations from their confrontation with this detailed and powerful mimesis of emotion that we find in Homer. We might observe, for example, that Achilles isn't one of the utterly ruined, one of the pantelos apolloletes, who think that nothing further bad can happen to them. On the contrary, Achilles knows that the loss of Patroclus wasn't the last of his sufferings. He's made to think about his own failure to provide for Peleus in his old age and the grief of Peleus after his own death. And that illustrates the continuing vulnerability that he shares with all human beings. The loss of Patroclus wasn't the worst, wasn't the end. Equally, though Peleus' sufferings are imminent, still they remain in the future. And we should note that Achilles' situation isn't quite the same as the situation of those people who, according to Aristotle, can be deflected from pity by being made to focus on their own imminent troubles, precisely because in Achilles' case, it's actually the other way around. Achilles is made to focus on his own sufferings because of the presence of another suffering individual. So it's not that he pities and then forgets about that pity to think of himself. It's that he pities and that facilitates his thinking of himself. There isn't the wedge there between self-absorption and other concern that Aristotle's example presupposes. Beyond that, it's interesting also that Aristotle uses an anecdote to illustrate the difference between the terrible, to deinon, the thing that we fear may happen to ourselves, and the pitiable, to eleienon, which is characteristic of the sufferings of others. And when he uses that anecdote, it's very interesting that it doesn't in fact show what he wants it to show. It doesn't bear out his contention that the terrible drives out the pitiable. He says that, but the story he tells doesn't prove it. And this is the story of the Pharaoh. He's called Amasis in Aristotle. He's called Psammenitus, the father of Amasis, in Herodotus. And the story in both cases is that the Pharaoh didn't weep when he saw his son being led out to his death, but he did weep when he encountered a former drinking companion who was reduced to the status of a beggar, on the basis that the fate of the son was terrible, but the fate of the friend was pitiable. So when he's confronted with the fate of his own son, it's too close and he doesn't weep. But when he's confronted with the fate of the friend, it's only pitiable and he does weep. So Amasis, or Psammenitus, like Achilles, is faced with imminent suffering on the part of a relative that he takes to be an evil for himself, and yet he's still able to pity someone who is less close to him. So even in the way that Aristotle himself tells the story, the terrible doesn't always drive out the pitiable. And the Amasis Psammenitus story contradicts the statement that people no longer feel pity when what they fear for themselves is imminent. The Pharaoh witnesses his son being led out to his death. His son is just about to be killed. This is terrible for him, and yet he's still capable of pity. So Aristotle makes a theoretical point and then undermines that theoretical point with the example that he gives. However all of this may be, there still remains a significant difference of emphasis between Aristotle's account of pity in the rhetoric and the dynamics of pity in the encounter between Achilles and Priam in Iliad 24. Fundamentally, this is a matter of Aristotle's emphasis on potentiality as an aspect of the vulnerability condition. Aristotle emphasizes evils which lie in the future, and so he emphasizes fear as the attitude towards our own sufferings that complements pity as a response to the sufferings of others. In Homer, by contrast, despite the importance of shared vulnerability as a condition for pity, there's also a much greater emphasis on grief. And I emphasize that this isn't an absolute distinction. Aristotle does recognize that you have to have suffered yourself in order to be able to respond with pity to the sufferings of others. He says explicitly that those who have already suffered are among those who can feel pity, who are capable of feeling pity, as are older people on the grounds of their wisdom and their experience. That's 1385b 24 to 26. But these two examples form part of a list of people who are so disposed as to think themselves liable to suffer in the future. And so it also includes the weak, people who think bad things are going to happen because of their weakness, those who are cowards, who are always afraid of bad stuff happening to them, and the educated, who are sensible enough to know that bad stuff can happen. 1385b 26 to 27. By contrast, those who have been very lucky in life and those who have been utterly ruined by life don't have this sense of vulnerability, 85b 18 to 25. So in Aristotle, life experience does matter. The experience of suffering does matter, but still Aristotle's focus is consistently on the future and on potentiality. The evils on which pity focuses are the kind of evils as we might expect to happen to ourselves or those we care about, 85b 14 to 15. In general, it's the things we're afraid of in our own case that we pity when they happen to other people, 86a 27 to 29. And it's perhaps implicit in this that these evils are also the sort of thing that would cause grief and lamentation when they do happen to us or those we love, but this isn't a point that Aristotle wants to emphasize. It's very different in Iliad 24. There, Priam asks Achilles to remember Peleus, but to pity him, to pity Priam, because his condition, Priam's condition, is even more pitiable at 24, 503 to 4. This moves Achilles to lamentation, to goos, spontaneous lamentation for his father. And goos is a typical marker of grief. As Priam then weeps for Hector, Achilles weeps for Peleus and Patroclus. He doesn't, or at least he doesn't explicitly weep for Priam, and he doesn't share Priam's grief for Hector. Achilles and Priam rather, experience together and at the same time and in the same place the same emotion, but with different objects and for different reasons. Achilles doesn't adopt Priam's emotional perspective, but Priam's presentation of that perspective is instrumental in making Achilles see the common ground between Priam's suffering and his own suffering. Priam highlights a similarity between his predicament, Peleus' predicament, and Achilles' own predicament. Priam and Achilles already know, and Peleus soon will know, what it's like to lose someone very close to you. Priam's grief makes him pitiable, but Achilles' grief enables his pity. Where Aristotle locates the self-referential aspect of pity in fear, Homer locates it in grief. For Homer, it's the things we grieve over in our own case that we pity when those things happen to other people. And an element of this closeness between pity and grief is visible even in the Greek vocabulary that's used in the scene. Priam asks directly for eleos. He says, auton te eleison, in lines 503 to 4. But what Achilles is said to show him by the narrator isn't eleos, it's oiktos in 513 to 18. And there's a degree of controversy over possible differences of nuance and connotation between eleos and oiktos when both of them refer to the emotion that we call pity. I've given you some of the references in the bibliography. If you look at the book by Walter Burkert from 1955, or the articles by Mary Scott, 1979, and various other of those sources, you find that people debate what the difference might be between eleos and oiktos. A lot of the time, they seem to be used more or less interchangeably. So they both mean pity in more or less similar ways. But there is one sense that oiktos has that eleos doesn't have, and this is the sense of lamentation. And this is very likely to be the basic and root sense of the term, because the term probably derives from the lamentatory interjection oi, oiktos, saying oi. The term's semantic development no doubt reflects a perception of commonality between grieving and pitying. Now, this doesn't mean that eleos couldn't also rest on that similarity between grieving and pitying. The fact that the typical expression of both eleos and grief is weeping suggests that it could. There's common ground between eleos and grief too. But it's simply that oiktos is especially appropriate there, where the link between Priam's grief, Achilles' grief, and Achilles' pity is so clearly drawn. The semantics of oiktos in general draw attention to a feature that's relevant also to eleos, that the common ground between grief and pity is tears and lamentation. The non-verbal behavior is identical. Priam's appeal to pity causes Achilles to grieve for his own losses, but the lamentation that expresses that grief forms part of the bridge between Priam's sorrows and the sorrows of Achilles that Priam sought to create. And the way that grief for our own losses can inform pity for another person highlights the self-referential aspect of pity. In some sense, it's partly about us too. But it's also typical in Homer to identify explicitly the self-referential aspect of shared grief. And so this takes us on to number 3 on the handout on page 2. So we see this self-referential aspect of shared grief twice in Iliad 19. First of all, when Briseis' lament over the body of Patroclus, in which she details her own considerable sufferings, is answered by the lamentation of the other captive women, each of whom is said by the narrator to be grieving for her own misfortunes under the pretext of grieving for Patroclus. So outwardly they're lamenting for Patroclus, inwardly they're remembering their own troubles, their own grief. Briseis' lament and the refrain that accompanies it, so Briseis laments and then the other women all join in a response, so call and response, lament and chorus, if you like. That is then soon followed by a speech of heartfelt pain and anguish on the part of Achilles that contains some of the same motifs. So Achilles laments the loss of Patroclus and other things. But when he imagines his own father, his own aged father, waiting at home for news of his son's death, the companions who join him in lamentation each remember their own loved ones at home. So they weep with him. He's weeping for his sorrows, and partly they're also weeping for their sorrows too. As in the Achilles and Priam scene of Iliad 24, one person's grief reminds, the word used is a part of mimneskomai, reminds other people of their own sorrows, and they weep and lament together. And there's plenty of other examples of this. So I've given you on page 3 of the handout a famous passage of shared lamentation from Book 4 of the Odyssey, but we don't have time to discuss that right now. We can discuss it later if you want. While these scenes of shared lamentation illustrate the self-referential side of lamentation, they don't detract in any way from the other regarding the pro-social side of lamentation, of shared lamentation. In our main passage in Iliad 24, back to number 1 on the handout, this is quite clear, not only because we have the narrator's word for it, that Achilles feels oiktos in line 516, but also because Achilles' thoughts of his father are deliberately provoked by Priam as a way of eliciting sympathy. Priam thinks it's a good idea to make Achilles think of his own father and his potential suffering as a way of eliciting pity or sympathy. Though Priam underestimates Peleus' sorrows, it's as a suffering individual that Peleus is evoked. And this involves an acceptance that reflecting on your own sorrows can be a basis for understanding the sorrows of other people. And Achilles confirms that acceptance in the parable of the jars of Zeus. But the purpose of that speech, as was famously pointed out, for example, by Rudolf Cassel and then later by Colin MacLeod, both of whom are in the bibliography, the purpose of that speech is explicitly consolatory. It contains many consolatory topoi that we find again and again in Greek and Roman literature. Other people suffer just as we do. And to realize that other people suffer just like us is to put our own sorrows in perspective. We're not being singled out in any way. This happens again and again to all of us. As Achilles puts it at the beginning and end of his words of consolation, in lines 524 and then again in 550, there's nothing to be achieved by lamentation. This isn't just about you, it happens to everybody, and everybody has to get over it. Everybody has to move on. This is a lesson that Achilles appears himself to be learning almost in the very moment that he imparts that lesson to Priam. The man who at the beginning of Book 24 was still dragging Hector's body around Patroclus's grave before leaving it to lie face down in the dust, now advises Priam to behave as he does. Let's now let our pains lie stored in our hearts, grieving though we are. There's got to be an end to grief, an end to lamentation. But the fact that Achilles follows this with an elaborate set piece of authoritative speech, an elaborate mythos, using the exemplary figures of Peleus and Priam to illustrate an absolutely fundamental tenet of ancient Greek popular morality, suggests that the lesson that Priam is being offered by Achilles is also a lesson for us. The way in which Achilles has come to deal with his emotions is now offered to Priam as a way of dealing with his emotions by means of a parable that suggests that recognizing the universality of human vulnerability to suffering gives all of us a way of managing our emotions and our troubles. It's not just that understanding other people's sufferings and other people's emotional responses to suffering proves accidentally beneficial to Achilles and Priam. It's rather that such an understanding is fundamental to the ways in which all human beings have to confront the inevitabilities of life. In a marked, exemplary passage such as this one, this has to be a reflection of the poem's sense of what it's doing, the poem's sense of what it is, its own ethos, its aesthetic, and its utility, what the poem is for. The Iliad holds out the prospect that the encounter with other people's emotions in literature can help us manage our own emotions in our lives. To move on to a slightly different point, we might confirm that the correlation of grief and pity is a fundamental aspect of the Iliad's ethos from a variety of sources, but it's especially apparent in these characteristic obituary notices or necrologies or necrologues that are often used to mark the deaths of minor warriors. This is number 4 on the handout. As we know, for example, from Jasper Griffin, these necrologies share a number of motifs with laments. The most prominent of these motifs in our main passage in Iliad 24 is the parents' and especially the father's grief for the son killed in battle, and the fact that the dead warrior is unable to care for his parents in his old age. So it's sad that there are parents left to mourn their children, and it's sad that the child will not be able to provide for the parents in their old age. The fact that these motifs and others like them occur also in necrologies confirms that the intended effect of the necrologies is pathos. We get them in laments and we get them in necrologies. And this is something that's central to the poem by Alice Oswald, Memorial. I don't know if you know this. It's a relatively recent English poem, which is created more or less entirely out of the similes that are used to mark the deaths of minor warriors in the Iliad and the necrologies that are used to mark those deaths. So Oswald leaves out all the action, all the narrative of the Iliad, and just leaves in the death scenes and the reactions to death, the similes and the necrologies. The necrologies, as Oswald observes, derive from the poetic tradition of the lament. She says, I like to think that the stories of individual soldiers recorded in the Iliad might be recollections of these laments woven into the narrative by poets who regularly perform both high epic and choral lyric poetry. Oswald is a classicist as well as a poet herself. This congruence of lament and necrology also confirms the closeness of grief and pity in Iliadic aesthetics. In the necrologies, these pathetic motifs are often left to speak for themselves, as in the case of Hippothous in Iliad 17, at number 4 on the handout, 17, 300 to 303. And you see there that Hippothous, like Achilles, is short-lived and destined to die far from home. So 2 typical motifs of the necrologies. He leaves his parents to mourn, and he leaves his parents to fend for themselves in old age. So multiple recurrent motifs in laments and necrologies. And what these motifs highlight is that you can grieve for this person. They highlight what's been called grievability, as emphasized recently by Eric Colhead, who's there in the bibliography and in number 4 in the handout. Eric takes this notion of grievability from Judith Butler, number 5 on the handout. And this account of Judith Butler in Frames of War and in other writings too resonates significantly with the Iliad. For Butler, grievability is predicated on vulnerability. It's predicated on the precariousness of life, the precariousness of human existence. And it's predicated on the fundamental fact that everyone dies. And this is all done in ways that have profound social and political implications. Not only are we fundamentally like everyone else, but this likeness to everyone else implies forms of openness towards other people that subsume in the we or in the us people that we tend to regard as other, people that we tend to regard not as us, but as them. Grievability depends on the inevitability of death and on the grief that comes with death. but grievability is also a feature of life as it's lived. So as Butler says there, I'll just read out the beginning of the text on the handout. She says, precisely because a living being may die, it's necessary to care for that being so that it may live. Only under conditions in which the loss would matter does the value of the life appear. Thus, grievability is a presupposition for the life that matters. Everybody dies, therefore everybody is grievable, therefore everybody's life matters. And Butler's writing in general terms about our knowing, interpreting, recognizing, responding to, and being responsible for the grievability of other people's lives. But she does also emphasize emotion, affectivity, including horror, moral revulsion, shock, and outrage when other people's precarious lives are snuffed out. And she also emphasizes emotions such as respect for other people's lives and guilt when other people's lives are damaged. But while the emotions of mutual dependence that precariousness implies are not necessarily relations of love or even care, as far as Butler is concerned, love and care may be facilitated by these conditions. She says that repeatedly. And yet there's no explicit role in Butler for compassion. And when she talks about being touched by other people's lives and deaths as a topic, this is in the context of the danger of being partial, being biased, being limited, when our emotional responses to violence stop short of understanding and interpretation and doing something about it. This is number 6 on the handout. And this does presuppose that a reasoned concern of a sort that allows us to be touched by all lives and deaths is desirable, but it also belongs with Butler's general and quite justifiable insistence on the need for moral judgment not to exist in a vacuum, but to give rise to effective political action too. In the Iliad, by contrast, we have a greater emphasis on the transformation in emotional terms, affective transformation as such. So the emphasis in the Iliad seems to be much more about what happens to us as feeling beings, both for the characters in the narrative and implicitly for us as the audience of the narrative. It's true, Achilles does insist on action. He says we need praxis in 524 and 550, before and after his speech. And he says we mustn't persist in grief. But the action he's thinking of seems to consist more or less in concluding the rituals of mourning and getting on with your life in all its vulnerability to continuing vicissitude. Equally, it's a feature of the Iliad that we shouldn't minimize, that Achilles' pity for Priam does consist in dealing with his own sorrows. It does consist in overcoming hatred, and it does consist in affirming the shared humanity of the enemy, the opposite side, protecting and caring for an elderly man who's been crushed by his sufferings in war, and then participating, at least to some extent, in the preparations for the funeral of his own worst enemy. That's very, very important, and it's very, very important as action. And yet, after that funeral has taken, or will go on, as we're reminded repeatedly towards the end of the Iliad. Just as war continued to be a way of life for all ancient Greek communities in which the Iliad was performed and read. So whatever effect the Iliad had on its readers, those readers went on to hate people and to kill them in large-scale annual bouts of warfare. The Iliadic approach also differs from Butler's in linking grievability so strongly to a single emotion. Grievability in Homer is all about pity. Whereas many necrologies present lamentatory topoi without explicit comment by the character or the narrator, as the case may be, when comments do occur, they confirm that the conditions that give rise to grief also give rise to pity. And we see this in Iliad 11, number 7 on the handout, where the pathetic themes of death far from home and lack of care after death for the parents are embedded in a speech in which Patroclus expresses his pity and sorrow at the suffering of his comrades. So when Patroclus saw Eurypylus, the brave son of Menoetius, pitied him, he otire him, and lamenting, olophuromenos, he spoke winged words of address. O wretched ones, he says. So in this passage, pity, oiktos, and lamentation, olophurestai, co-occur. Earlier in the same book, the death of Iphidamas, a young husband who was killed far away from his new wife, attracts the pity of the narrator himself, 241 to 243. So the narrator says, so he fell on the spot and into the sleep of bronze, pitiable, oiktros, trying to help his townsfolk, far from the wedded wife he'd wooed. He'd had no joy of her at all, though he'd given a lot to win her. So in both these passages, we're dealing with oiktos, the pity term that also connotes lamentation. So the adjective oiktros that's used in the second passage cited there is, I would say, the Greek for grievable, grievability. The crucial point here is that passages like these present as pitiable what is for the individual warrior's relatives and dependents a source of grief. In contrast to Aristotle's position in the rhetoric, that we pity in others what we fear happening to ourselves, the central aesthetic and affective appeal of the Iliad is that we pity in others not only what we grieve over when it does happen to us, but also what we recognize as being grievable from the point of view of those who care for the individual in question. What we pity is actually or potentially someone's grief. And we recognize that grievability on the basis of our own capacity to suffer and our own capacity to grieve. Because we want other people to grieve for us, because we want to grieve for our relatives, we can understand the grievability of other people's lives. The fundamental point that human lives are inherently precarious and inherently grievable permeates ancient Greek literature and thought. This notion of the mutability of fortune that we have in Iliad 24 is absolutely fundamental in Greek literature. It's obviously also fundamental in Aristotle's Poetics. The change of fortune is the metabole there is absolutely fundamental to the definition of the power of tragedy in the Poetics. And if there was time, we would talk about that. In the full paper that I've sent round, you can read a little bit more about the Poetics. But just to save time here, I'll just make one general point about the Poetics. Whatever Aristotle may have meant by catharsis in chapter 6 of the Poetics, we can be absolutely sure that Aristotle regarded the audience's affective emotional response to tragic suffering as in some way beneficial. But it's a substantial difference between the Poetics and the Iliad that grief and grievability don't play a significant role in Aristotle's account. And this points to a further difference between Aristotle and Homer on the issue of the compassion that's aroused by the sufferings of other people. In his references to both pity and fear, Aristotle focuses almost entirely on our emotions as onlookers, on the emotions of the people who pity. So the encounter with the emotions of other people that's so prominent in Homer plays no explicit role in the account of pity in the rhetoric or in the theorization of tragic pity as an audience response in the Poetics. So Aristotle says almost nothing about the sufferings and the emotions of the characters who suffer that arouse our pity. Aristotle emphasizes the fact of suffering and the misfortunes that happen to people. He doesn't emphasize the impact made on us by the emotional ways in which the objects of our pity respond to their own misfortunes. And that's a substantial difference between Aristotle and Plato, because in Book 10 of the Republic, Plato does place huge emphasis on the display and performance of grief as the cause of pity and as the object of pity in the audiences of epic and tragic poetry. And we see this in Republic 10's critique of the supposedly negative effects of epic and tragic poetry on the emotional well-being of their audiences. So this is the final point in the handout, number 8. So the important points here are, first, that audience emotions in that passage of the Republic are clearly being represented as focusing directly on the emotions of the characters. The characters express their emotions, and we express emotion for those characters and their emotions. Secondly, it's clear that pity responds to the expression of grief. They weep in grief, and we weep in pity for their grief. Thirdly, it's clear that there's a significant degree of overlap between the experience and expression of grief and pity. Fourth, it's clear that there's a relation between the pity that we feel when others grieve and our own experience of grief. You notice in particular in that passage that the emotional reaction that we're supposed to restrain, according to Socrates, in dealing with our own misfortunes is described as to elenon, the pitiable. The lamentation, so when we grieve for our own misfortunes, what Plato says we're doing is cultivating to elenon, the pitiable. The lamentation that expresses grief is the pitiable par excellence. And whereas in Homer, Achilles' own experience of grief grounds his pity for Priam, here in the Republic, our pity for characters in epic and tragedy, like Achilles and Priam, springs from the same source as the grief that we would feel over our own sufferings. If we give rise to pity for fictional characters, Plato says, then we won't be able to restrain our own grief when bad things happen to us. So in this passage, Plato agrees with Homer about the relation between pity and grief, but he disagrees completely with the idea that the encounter with others' emotions in tragic poetry can help us manage our own emotions. Aristotle in the Poetics does share that view, the Homeric view, that encountering other people's emotions in literature is good for us in managing our own emotions. But perhaps the fact that he's aware of Plato's charge that sharing grief through pity perhaps risks losing the capacity for self-control. Perhaps this is one reason why his own accounts of pity in the rhetoric and the Poetics relate it not to grief, but to fear, fear fostered by our vulnerability to potential misfortune. He doesn't bring in the grievability that links others' lives to our own. So that's all I wanted to. Very much for listening.
Thank you, Douglas, very much. That was very interesting, very inspiring, and I know that this will generate a lot of questions and comments. So thanks very much.
Okay.
Claudia, no sé si hay alguna pregunta ya.
Sí, hay alguna. Thank you very much, Douglas. Yes, the first question is in English, so I will just read it from Viviana Suñol. And the question is, can we say that the nature of compassion is mediated by, oh my God, sorry, is mediated by other emotions, grief in Homer and fear in Aristotle? This implies that pity necessarily interrelates with other emotions to occur?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I think Aristotle thinks that emotions overlap. He thinks that one emotion can involve other emotions. So a very simple example, when he defines anger, he says anger involves elpis. Anger involves the elpis of timoria, the elpis of retribution, redress, or revenge. And so he's not worried about making these things all completely distinct. I would need to think harder about whether the correct terminology is the terminology of mediation. So yeah, I guess it works. So, I mean, I said at one point that Achilles' pity in Iliad 24 is facilitated by his grief. So in that case, you could say that his pity is mediated by grief. And I think there are good examples of that elsewhere in Homer, some of which I've given you under number 4 on the handout. In Aristotle, I think the case of pity is slightly different. It's not so much a matter of mediation, because the way Aristotle presents things, the suffering that we are liable to if we're capable of pity for other people is purely potential, according to him. As I said, the example he gives of the Pharaoh actually contradicts that insistence, but he does explicitly insist on the idea that the suffering, the potential for suffering that allows us to pity other people must indeed be a potential. It shouldn't be actual. And so in Aristotle, at least in Book 2 of the Rhetoric, we don't experience fear in order to experience pity. It's that the fact that these things that happen to these people are the kind of thing we would fear, potentially, that enables us to feel pity. So the fear there is a quality, the fearfulness, the terribleness, the denotes of the circumstance is a quality of that circumstance, but the actual emotion remains potential rather than actual. And so I'm not sure that the pity is mediated by fear, but it clearly is conditioned by the potential for fear. It's slightly different in the Poetics, isn't it? So there we feel pity and fear together. And so clearly Aristotle does there agree with you that pity is accompanied by fear, and so possibly mediated by fear too.
Thank you. Recuerdo a todos, por favor, que las preguntas sean muy breves, porque veo allí una extensa. Antes otra cuestión y luego, si tengo tiempo, sí que leo esa pregunta bastante larga de Daniel Nascimento. Facundo ha preguntado, esta es para traducir, Emiliano, es al revés, cuando hay falta de compasión, sea por indiferencia o impiedad, ¿podría ocurrir por un desencuentro con el otro debido a una diferencia irreconciliable, ya sea moral, cultural, racial o de clase?
Okay, I will translate that question, Douglas. It has to do with situations in which there is a lack of compassion. Mm-hmm. Is this motivated because there is a difference that cannot be overcome with the other, and that difference might be a difference in status or a racial difference, a difference to someone who does not share any sort of common ground with people. So could you please talk a little about that?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. That's it's both an empirical point and it's a theoretical point in Aristotle. So, I mean, one of the lessons of the Iliad, I think, is that we can, given the right circumstances, given the right conditions, and given the right narrative, we can experience pity for almost anyone. So, including for the father of the man that we earlier wanted completely to obliterate. So if Achilles could, he says, he would utterly destroy the memory, any trace of the existence of Hector at the height of his anger. So clearly there is no recognition whatsoever of common humanity between Achilles and Hector. And there's no reason to expect that there would be recognition of common humanity between Achilles and Hector's parents. And in fact, when Priam is preparing to make his journey to ransom the body of Hector, it's emphasized what, although the ransom has been elaborately prepared for, it's still emphasized what a huge undertaking this is. And one of the ways in which that is emphasized is the utter hatred that Hecuba still feels for Achilles. She says he's a monster. She said that she would like to eat his liver, just as Achilles already said that he would like to eat Hector's liver. So eating liver isn't compassionate. In Aristotle, it's slightly different. So whereas in Homer, even in spite of these extreme degrees of othering, so, you know, treating another human being's body as though it's just meat, dragging it round as though it's just an object behind your chariot, that can be overcome. And the animosity that's felt between Achilles and Hector's family can be overcome. And Achilles is capable of compassion even for the other side. And that's important. But in Aristotle, there's much more emphasis on, I think, the pragmatics, the realistic boundaries of that. And so he points out that, you know, we don't feel pity for people who are too far away from us, for pity who are too different from us. He points out, as I think Daniel is pointing out in the chat, he points out that we don't feel pity for people who are too close to us either. So it's got to be just right, like Goldilocks, not too close, not too distant. If they're too distant, then we don't feel this compassion for them. So we don't feel compassion, Aristotle says, for people who lived 1,000 years ago, because they're nothing to us. We don't feel compassion for people who are utterly different from ourselves. And in fact, there's good empirical evidence from contemporary psychology that degrees of what they call empathy vary according to in-group and out-group subjects. So in the lab, when people are shown, let's say, white faces and black faces, if they're white, they feel spontaneously, or sometimes they feel spontaneously less empathy for the black faces than they do for the white faces. And it can clearly be shown that in non-laboratory situations, this is kind of going on as well. And so that's one of the things that should give us pause when we want to essentialize these things. So some people, for example, if we were talking about this with a group of philosophers or psychologists, they might want to say that compassion is something that's, let's say, to use their metaphor, hardwired, because we've got these mirror neurons that allow us to understand the sufferings of other people. Well, we do have these mirror neurons, and they may allow us to understand the sufferings of other people, but practice and experiment have shown that we don't respond equally to members of our own immediate groups or members of outgroups that we regard as distinct from ourselves. And so one of the things we have to do is to learn how to do that. And one of the ways in which we might learn how to do that is to read things like the Iliad.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great, thanks.
Bien, thank you. So, the question, la pregunta de Daniel ya ha sido respondida, ¿verdad? Porque la ha leído del chat Douglas. I have relating to the lack of Helios, I was thinking about comedy, because, you know, comedy is my topic of research. And what I think in comedy that it is almost impossible just for the characters to arouse pity from the audience. And well, there can be a lot of facts to explain this, why this happens. Yeah. One of them is the notion of vulnerability that you talk about, because that's not a notion or a concept which is developed in comedy, or just because the nature of the characters that calls for pity, I mean, they deserve the grief, so they can be pitiable. Yep. And what can you tell me about that?
Yeah, well, that's in fact related, I think, to the previous point. So Aristotle is good on this, in fact. So he points out that whether or not you pity someone else isn't necessarily just a matter of the bare situation. It's not just a matter of the facts of the situation. It's a matter of how those contexts and conditions are represented. So it's fundamentally a matter of narrative. It's a matter of, it's something that's structured. It has to be structured a certain way. And in that passage somewhere in the Poetics, I forget exactly where, but kind of relatively close to the beginning, if I remember rightly, he makes the important point that we don't respond equally towards people to whom we're well disposed and people towards whom we're badly disposed. So if we can create the conditions for, let's say, a different kind of sympathy, not emotional sympathy, but for some kind of positive positive sharing of goals and ends and projects, if that can be created through a narrative means or through a dramatic means, then we can be induced to feel sympathy for people who do bad things in ways that we wouldn't necessarily feel if the narrative had been different, if the conditions had been set up differently, and those people had not done bad things, but even done good things. So it's not a matter of just whether they're nice or nasty, whether they're good or bad. It's a matter of how they're represented, and that's a matter of context. And then that's a difference in the genres between tragedy and comedy. So comedy doesn't construct scenarios in those ways. Comedy tends to construct scenarios of identification with, let's say, the comic hero, so the likes of the sausage seller, and strategies of alienation from, let's say, people like Paflagon. And so the suffering of those people when they get what's coming to them is a matter of them getting what's coming to them. It's constructed in terms of this opposition between those whose projects we're induced to favor and those whose projects we're induced to disfavor.
Okay, thank you. Two more questions. They are written in English, and you can follow the chat also because of my accent. No? Fernando Falcón asked, you emphasize that in the Iliad, pity leads the way to recognition of a shared humanity, but not to political action in a way that it is different to the treatment in Butler's account of grievability. It is political concern then that could be the main difference between Homer and Plato's value of pity?
That's the difference between Homer and Butler. So Butler is arguing for engaged political action rather than just, so, you know, she's making the anti-humanist point, and the point that's always made against humanist literature. And of course, the first document of humanist literature is the Iliad, is that humanism is all very well. It allows us to sit back and congratulate ourselves on our fine feelings, but it doesn't change anything. It doesn't get us off our behinds to get out on the streets and do something about it. So that's the point she's making. When grief and pity are represented as negative in Book 10 of the Republic, politics is there in the background, insofar as the training of the personality involves the training of aspects of human nature, let's say, that also manifest themselves in the state. And if we train the personality well, then there will be knock-on consequences on the constitution of the state. And we will be able to do two things simultaneously. We'll be able to achieve the full potentiality of the state and the full potentiality of the individual within the state. So that's what Plato is trying to achieve. But I think that in Republic 10, he's dealing more with one aspect of that than he is with the other aspect. He's dealing with the fact that this is about the harmony of the three desires that exist within the tripartite soul for the truth and the good, for honor and for pleasure. And he presents grief as a kind of desire, a desire for a particular kind of pleasure. So grief there is clearly being represented as a function of the epithumeitikon. Mm-hmm. And the idea is that if you give too much scope for grief, then you're giving too much power to the epithumeitikon, and your personality is out of kilter. Now, if your personality is out of kilter, then your state will be out of kilter, according to Plato. But I think that's an argument that we have to supply rather than the immediate point of the argument in Republic 10. If that's clear. So the answer is kind of yes and no.
Thank you. Te doy la palabra, Emiliano, para que leas, el inglés va a ser seguramente más entendible, las preguntas de María Cecilia y luego la de Graciela Sechín, por favor.
Bueno, Claudia. Cecilia, de Miranda Coelho Douglas, She's asking, and you can read the question there. Could you, if possible, comment on Gorgias' encomium 9 in connection to Homer Aristotle, the Elios Polydracus, and how vision, physicality affects emotion? Ariadne's in Heroids, and she quotes, "And now you have been swept beyond my vision, then at last I let flow my tears," came to her mind as kind of an opposite scenario.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So that passage there in Gorgias' encomium of Helen is clearly, I think, the passage that Plato has in mind in the passage I've cited from Republic 10. So when Socrates there says that people think it's all right to feel pity for characters in tragic poetry on the basis that one is merely a spectator of others' pathe, he's virtually quoting Gorgias there. He's quoting what Gorgias says about the power of words, the power of poetry to elicit this pothos philopenthes and the idiontipathema that we feel on the basis of the sufferings of others. So Gorgias is kind of arguing for, let's say, an Aristotelian position there, because Gorgias's emotions are also pity and fear. And he's, given that this is meant to be part of a defense of Helen, he's arguing for this in a positive way. So Gorgias and Aristotle there are two nodes in a nexus of traditional Greek approaches to the emotional effects of poetry that emphasize pity and fear above all. Gorgias, it's true, does emphasize the physical symptoms. So another good parallel for the Gorgias passage is Plato's Ion, where it's very much a matter of the physically embodied performer, Ion, physically representing to the audience the emotions of the characters in the Homeric narrative, but also the emotions that he, as a kind of internal audience, experiences towards the emotions of those characters, and which then his own audience, as he does his performance, should experience towards the characters of the story. So that's all very, very embodied, and it's again all about pity and fear and tears and so on. So there's a close connection between all of these passages. So the point about non-verbal behavior and physical symptoms and embodiment is much stronger in Republic 10, in the Ion, and in Gorgias than it is in Aristotle. Aristotle only really goes in for this kind of thing once in the Poetics, is it chapter, I forget which chapter it is, it's in the teens somewhere, where he's talking about opsis. And he says that you should bring about pity and fear by the mythos itself, and not by special effects, not by opsis, not by visuality. And so it's perfectly possible, he says, to bring these things about solely by reading the mythos rather than by seeing the mythos performed. So he is arguing there for a diminished need for physically embodied performance and physically embodied response. And that goes, I think, with what I was saying about his approach in the rhetoric too, is that he's interested in our emotions as potential audience members of rhetoric or other genres in the rhetoric. But he's not particularly interested in the symptoms and behavioral expressions and nonverbal behavior of those emotions. He says very little about that. And he says almost nothing about the physical expressions and symptoms and nonverbal behavior of those who attract our emotions. He says even less about that. So on the one hand, you can put Gorgias and Plato in the same box, and that they emphasize embodiment and nonverbal behavior and symptoms and expressions. And Aristotle in a different box, in that it's much more about the structured sequence of the narrative and how you structure a narrative in certain ways in order to get a certain response. But Aristotle isn't oblivious to the influence of performance. So not in the account of the emotions in book 2, but in the account of Lexis in book 3, he has a really interesting passage in which he says, you can enhance the power of lexis by means of emotional performance. And you can elicit emotions in your audience by means of the emotional color that you lend your lexis in performance. And he talks about someone who gives a show, performs anger at a particular injustice. And then he says that the psyche of the audience makes a certain inference that if he's angry about this scenario, this must be the kind of scenario about which one would get angry, and therefore they're more inclined to believe him. So Aristotle does also know the power of embodied performance and nonverbal behavior and the paralinguistic phenomena as well. And of course, Cecilia is asking also about visualization. And this is fundamental to Aristotle's account of emotion. So almost all the emotions have some part in their definition of the verb phainesthai. And so people have taken this as a purely ordinary language feature of Aristotle's approach to emotion, but it's not. It's a theoretical feature of his account. And so Aristotle believes that phantasia is essential for emotion. And phantasia is construing a certain scenario in a certain way. But phantasia for Aristotle, he says, for example, at the end of book 1 of the Rhetoric, is one step removed from aesthesis. It's a weak aesthesis. It's based on sensory perception. So phantasia is like sensory perception. And sensory perception, of course, as Aristotle emphasizes in the De Anima, is something that only embodied organisms can experience. So you need a body. You need a body that can feel and touch and see in order to have emotion. Aesthesis, Aristotle says in the De Anima, is a kind of krisis. And emotions, he says in the Rhetoric, are the things that lead us to change our krisis, to change our judgments. So there's judgment involved there, this cognitive thing, as some people sometimes say, at all levels of the experience. But there's also a physical embodied element at all levels of the experience as well. And of course, Aristotle believes in an indissoluble unity of the psyche and the hule. So his theory is hylomorphic. So he says there's nothing, in fact. There's no pathos of the psyche that is without body. Mm-hmm. And a full definition of all of this has to encompass both the dialectical aspect, the logos, but also the symptoms and the hule, the matter. So Aristotle says comparatively little about the body and its expressions and symptoms, but it's always presupposed, I think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Douglas. And we have, since we're already at 1 here at 1 p.m., we have a last question by Graciela. Mm-hmm. She thanks you for the wonderful talk, and she asks, what can you tell us about Thetis' lament in book 18 in relationship with the present grief and a future pity?
Yeah. Well, that's a good point as well. And that relates, I think, to Daniel's question earlier on, which we didn't get a chance to deal with. But maybe we can deal with it here too. So Thetis is obviously Achilles' mother. But she grieves for him before his death. And that grief that she shows for him before his death anticipates proleptically his death. So it enacts that notoriously, as people point out for literary reasons in connection with the approach known as neo-analysis. It actually recalls Achilles' actual death as it must have been narrated in the tradition. And so audience members are thinking of what they know of the wider tradition of the Trojan War, and therefore thinking of episodes that occur after the end of the Iliad when Achilles himself will die. So when Thetis takes his head, we know from geometric vases, that's mourning. She's treating him as though he's already dead. So that's kind of what I was saying about Achilles and Peleus in Iliad 24. Achilles is imagining Peleus rather, reacting to him as if he were already dead too. And that's kind of similar to what happens with Hector in book 6 of the Iliad. So Hector goes back to battle, having rejected Andromache's advice to stay within the walls and defend the city where it's most vulnerable, or even though that's good advice. And he goes off to battle, and it's not the last time he will go to battle, but still Andromache and all the other Trojan women mourn him as if he were already dead, in fact, in the same way as they do mourn him in books 24 and 22. So Andromache mourns singly, and the women all join in. So there's quite a lot in Homer about this proleptic mourning. And that relates to the point that I mentioned also about the pro-social aspects of mourning in Homer. So you can mourn for your own reasons, with someone or for someone. And that is obviously about your own suffering. So Thetis is clearly affected by Achilles' death. It makes her feel bad that her son is going to die, especially because she's a goddess and she lives forever, and he's very, very short-lived. So this is profoundly tragic. It's the lamentatory motif of the necrology writ large. Not only will Achilles not be able to look after his mother in her old age, she won't have an old age. She'll live forever without him. So this is very, very pathetic. But of course, that's Thetis's problem. It's her own suffering. And yet, her own suffering isn't separate from Achilles' suffering. And so it's shared. It's shared suffering. And therefore, it's not selfish, not entirely selfish. It's pro-social too. And we see that in all these other cases where people mourn for their own reasons, together with other people mourning for their reasons. And yet it's also supportive. It helps. It helps to share your grief. This is a thing that Aristotle mentions not in connection with pity. So he doesn't talk about sharing emotion when he talks about pity, but he talks about sharing emotion when he talks about friendship. So both briefly in the Rhetoric and in much greater detail in Ethics Book 8 and 9, Aristotle emphasizes that friends share the same pleasures and pains. And among friends, among philoi, of course, he includes parents and children. They share the same pleasures and pains. And that takes us to Daniel's point about the example of Amasis Psamenitis. So Aristotle's point there is that Amasis, as he calls him, doesn't express emotion at the imminent death of his son, because that's his own suffering. And therefore he's employing the cultural norm, which says that you should restrain your own sufferings. The very cultural norm that Plato was trying to uphold in Republic Book 10. The idea that one's own sufferings are too great to give ventilation to. They're too big to express, precisely because they're one's own. Whereas the sufferings of other people, he says, can be recognized and can lead to emotional demonstrativeness. So Aristotle's point in that passage is that this way in which we subsume all our philoi, all our relatives, all our close friends within ourselves as a single unit, and therefore don't focus on others when we're focusing on ourselves. It's kind of a good point, and it's true that there's a distinction between those whose sufferings are so close to ours that they are our own sufferings, and in those whose sufferings are less close to ours, and therefore are sufferings that we respond to as other to other. That distinction does hold, but still Aristotle, I think, is wrong to say that there cannot be a pro-social aspect to the shared suffering that you have, for example, between a parent and a child. So this is precisely what we have in the Iliad, but it's also precisely what we have in the tale of Psamenitis or Amasis. So Psamenitis doesn't weep for his son, but he does weep for his friend. Mm-hmm. But he is suffering at the fate of his son. He knows what the fate of the son is. It does cause him pain. It's just that he doesn't give expression to that pain. And yet, so in that situation, it just isn't true that the suffering of someone who's so close to you that they're part of yourself makes you focus on yourself and immediately diminishes your focus on other people. The two things can coexist, despite what Aristotle says. And in fact, the example he gives shows that they can coexist. And I think that's a way of showing that all of these emotions, whether they're for our philoi, for our relatives, or for people who are less close to us, but who still make an effect on us, they're not purely self-referential. They have these self-referential aspects, but they're also social. They're also shared, and they're also other regarding to some extent as well.
Thank you very much, Douglas. I think that was, Claudia, the last question. Creo que ya no hay más preguntas y ya estamos en la hora. We're already reaching our deadline. So we are very grateful once again, Douglas, for the time that you devoted to us. We know that you have been losing some precious summer time on a Saturday in Edinburgh. So
a rare Saturday, yeah, when the sun is shining.
We're not going to keep you here more than necessary. Creo que podemos simplemente colocar nuestros micrófonos y aplaudir para que escuche al menos a la distancia los aplausos. We're going to applaud you with our open microphones.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you
I
very much.
will have a glass of Malbec now in the garden to celebrate.
We're sending it now.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, so thank you all very much for listening. Thank you very much for your questions. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. I just wish we could all be in the same room, but that will happen again in future, I'm sure.
That will happen. That's for sure, and that's a promise.
Okay, thank you. And thank you to Emiliano and everybody, Claudia, for the organization, and great to see so many old friends too.
Okay, thank you very much, Douglas. It was a pleasure to have you, and we hope that very soon you'll be again among us in La Plata or Buenos Aires.
I hope so.
Okay.
Okay, have a good weekend, all of you.
Thank you. Para el resto, muchas gracias de haber participado y les recuerdo que la próxima conferencia será el 14 de agosto en el mismo horario, 14:30. Nos va a hablar Andreas Serafim.
11:30.
11:30, Andreas Serafim de la Academia de Atenas, y el título de su conferencia es The Body of Affectivity, Non-Verbal Communication, Emotions and the Rhetoric of Division in Attic Oratory. Los esperamos a todos. Vuelvo a agradecerles. Ha sido un placer.
Buen fin de semana.
Okay.
Goodbye.